Why would an empire stretching across seas and continents refuse to treat religion as a private matter of the temple? Why would it place faith at the very center of power? For Rome, this was not a side question. It was a question of survival. Stand in the forum at first light. Sandals strike the paving stones. Cloaks rustle as people move between the columns. Thin sacrificial smoke drifts and mixes with the wind. On one side, swords, standards, commands. On the other, prayers, altars, signs in the sky. And in that contrast, Rome saw itself. The Romans believed that the fate of the community could endure only so long as pax deorum, harmony with the gods, was preserved through proper ritual and careful attention to detail. Thus pietas, dutiful reverence toward gods, ancestors, homeland, and family, was not merely a private virtue. It was a measure of those who sought to rule. And here lies Rome's paradox. Conquerors of continents could still slow their step before a small omen, because even the highest leader had to appear willing to heed the sacred. Auspicia and the role of the augur shaped many major Roman decisions. To understand how Rome governed, we must first look where it prayed before it decided. And if you want to go deeper into why Rome placed the fate of a shared world upon sacred belief, subscribe and join me on this journey. To see the deepest living current of Roman religion, it is sometimes better to begin not with a great temple, but with a small room lit by a flickering oil lamp. The household horarium, with its small figures of the Laras, Penates, and the householder's genius, shows the sacred present beside meals, weddings, blessings, and ordinary anxieties. Here, the role of the household head was tied not only to decision-making, but to the duty of maintaining the family's pattern of reverence. Suppose you entered a house in Pompeii, saw the wall-knit shrine and traces of offerings still preserved. You would feel that Roman order was nourished by rites close to the hand of the living. From house to square, the same thread remained. Authority wished to endure only by tending the sacred in everyday life. However long ancestral memory endured, it was still not enough to keep a crowded city from unease. The Romans feared something deeper. If harmony with the gods were disturbed, would the community's rhythm of peace crack with it? Out of that fear, they guarded the idea of pax deorum as a sacred balance that had to be tended through careful ritual. Public altars were therefore not the backdrop to a festival. They were places where rulers showed that they knew how to revere properly. The prayer had to be exact, the gestures correct, the offering fitting, the moment favorable. A mistake could require the rite to begin again. To modern eyes, this precision can seem excessive. But to Rome, accuracy in small things was how one steadied great things. In the thin smoke rising from the altar, the city did not merely offer sacrifice. It reassured itself that the common order was still being kept intact. From the altar, the story opens at once into the square, where the sacred and the work of rule stood closer together than we often imagine. Religio publica, the piety of shared civic life, was not pushed into a hidden corner, but appeared in the movement of the forum, in arguments, proclamations, and the eyes of the crowd. Rome's great temples, especially the tradition of Jupiter worship at the symbolic center of the city, reminded all that rulers wished to place themselves beneath an order higher than their own will. Suppose you stood in the square early in the morning, hearing footsteps echo on stone, watching priests pass in ceremonial dress, then lifting your gaze to the shadow of the temple. You would understand why religion in Rome was not a private matter. It was the language of legitimacy, the setting around every important decision. To understand what Roman power was saying, we must first see where it bowed. Then another subtle question appeared before any decision was announced. Was this the right moment? In Rome, many great actions did not rest solely on the will of the ruler, but were tied to seeking signs through auspicia and the art of reading omens. The image of a priest with a curved staff, the lituus, was not merely a mark of office. It signaled the authority to read a portion of sky, a bird's flight path, a sign deemed meaningful before public action. For the Romans, this touched the legitimacy of action itself. The city moved forward only when it felt its decision did not violate sacred order. Thus the pause before acting became as important as the act itself. Here, religion did not make power weak. It made power cautious, capable of restraint before speaking and before striking. But who preserved feast days, ritual formulas, sacrificial rules, and the memory of rites so that a city would not lose its rhythm? The answer lay with priestly colleges such as the pontifices and augurs, men who stood within religious life while also shaping the rhythm of public affairs. Here, authority came not only from office, but from the responsibility of preserving sacred knowledge across generations. The ritual calendar carved in stone, the fasti, was not simply a schedule of dates. It was the published rhythm of the city, marking which days favored public business and which belonged to sacred observance. Vestments, cover heads, and signs of office made visible a tradition with structure and long memory. What is striking is that such quiet details helped create Rome's continuity. When time itself was marked by the sacred, power also appeared as part of an enduring ancestral pattern. There were moments when the whole weight of Rome rested in words spoken under witness. Sacramentum and iusiorandum show that the Romans did not treat an oath as an empty rite. It was a bond tying honor, duty, and fear of offending the sacred into a single instant. When someone pledged himself before the court, before the community, and before the gods, his words carried a weight far beyond ordinary speech. Legal inscriptions and formal oath procedures, therefore, did more than record terms. They created a space in which the speaker placed himself beneath the gaze of common standards. What is memorable here is that Rome did not fully separate law from religion, nor blur them into one shapeless mass. It let the two currents meet in the promise. And when a community gives real weight to oaths, order is often maintained first by honor, and only later by harsher measures. To see the deepest living current of Roman religion, it is sometimes better to begin not with a great temple, but with a small room lit by a flickering oil lamp. The household orarium, with its small figures of the Laras, Penates, and the householder's genius, shows the sacred present beside meals, weddings, blessings, and ordinary anxieties. Here, the role of the household head was tied not only to decision-making, but to the duty of maintaining the family's pattern of reverence. Suppose you enter a house in Pompeii, saw the wall-knit shrine and traces of offerings still preserved. You would feel that Roman order was nourished by rites close to the hand of the living. From house to square, the same thread remained. Authority wished to endure only by tending the sacred in everyday life. Leaving the household and entering the camp, we meet another embodiment of the same principle. Military discipline did not rest on command alone, but was bound tightly by a sacred oath. The sacramenta militare meant that a soldier did not merely promise obedience to his commander. He placed that promise beneath the gods and beneath the eyes of his comrades. Thus standards and military insignia, signa, rose above simple unit markers. They gathered campaign memory, loyalty, and collective honor, and in the soldier's eyes took on an almost sacred quality. In the camp, where order had to be preserved amid distance and exhaustion, such symbols gave the soldier's promise a depth beyond momentary fear. A distinctly Roman paradox appears here. The farther from the center they went, the more they needed a sacred point of support to keep the ranks from unraveling. In that setting, religion gave discipline a soul. Once Rome moved beyond the Italian peninsula, the question became larger than any square in the capital. How could many lands, different in language, memory, and religious custom, be held within one order? From here, emperor reverence gradually emerged as a symbolic language capable of wide connection. Coins bearing the emperor's image passed through merchants' hands, triumphal arches turned victory into lasting form, and temples of Roma and Augustus in the provinces showed the presence of central authority far from home. Yet it was also here that the limits of obedience became clear. Not every region received these symbols in the same way, at the same pace, or to the same degree. Rome's strength lay in its ability to place a shared symbol above local difference. Its fragility lay there too. And so the next step in the story becomes a harder question. How must authority persuade in order to be durably received? At that threshold, we need to slow down and look more closely at the Augustan turning point. Not simply a victor after civil war, but a ruler who understood that authority would endure only if set within a repeatable rhythm of worship. After years of rupture, Rome needed more than surface peace. It needed to feel that order had been rejoined to the sacred. Thus, under Augustus, restoring temples, reviving rites, and joining the ruler's image to the community's language of reverence were not decorative touches, but pillars of a new structure of rule. This was how authority presented itself as guardian of inherited order, not merely as a new regime. Here, the story of emperor reverence begins to take on a distinctly Roman form, not severed from older tradition, but inserted into it, gently, deeply, so that new power appeared as continuity rather than break. If you want to see that turning point in stone and light, look to the Arapaces, where worship and political imagery meet in a carefully arranged setting. Built to honor Augustus and tied to the idea of peace in his era, it shows how Romans could turn an altar into a declaration of common order. What matters is not only the date or the beauty of the carvings, but the feeling the monument creates. Peace does not appear as emptiness after war, but as a condition protected, commemorated, and placed within ritual. From here, authority spoke not only through decrees or victories, but through ceremonial imagery that people could see, walk around, and remember. In the rhythm of shadows crossing stone, we see Rome's talent clearly, making a political idea appear as an act of reverence. But Augustus' authority did not stop at the capital. As imperial rule spread, another question emerged. How could distant regions feel they stood beneath the same horizon as Rome without fully surrendering their older ways? One important answer was the cult of Roma and Augustus in the provinces. There, the central symbol was not invoked only in words. It had altars, meeting days, rites, and local faces taking part. In many regions, especially the Greek-speaking East, granting sacred honors to rulers had precedence already. Rome therefore did not simply impose from above. It entered a familiar habit and reshaped it to its own rhythm. That is part of its durability. It did not always force people to kneel, but build a ceremonial frame dignified enough that communities could see advantage in stepping into it. In this way, attachment to imperial rule acquired a language both august and calculating. One of the clearest scenes of that encounter appears at Lugdunum, where the altar of Roma and Augustus became a recurring gathering point for representatives of local communities. Here, reverence was not merely an act before an altar. It came with assembly, honor, shared ritual, and the visible presence of men speaking for their regions. Britannica notes that provincial delegates could meet in council not only to express satisfaction, but also to voice grievances. That detail makes the scene especially profound. Roman authority was not seeking praise alone, but creating a framework in which attachment could be enacted through ritual and petition alike. Suppose you were a local leader entering that ceremony. Between the symbols of Roma and Augustus, would you only be bowing your head, or also seeking an honorable place for your land within a larger order? From Lugdunum, we see more clearly something often overlooked. Emperor reverence did not only elevate the ruler, it also opened a seat of honor for local elites, a seat high enough that they wanted to sit in it, yet always placed beneath the imperial symbol. Priesthoods, the right to preside at ritual, position within processions, and public visibility all brought a kind of prestige that was local in color yet linked to Rome. Many participants were therefore not moved by fear or habit alone, they also saw a path upward in the eyes of their neighbors. This is a distinctly Roman form of voluntariness within constraint. No need to drag people in by hand, if one can build a frame of honor into which they step on their own. In that sense, religion under the Roman Empire appears not only as command from above, but as a spiritual compact, exchange for standing, recognition, and a place in a wider order. Yet that arrangement could endure only if the central symbol entered everyday rhythm, not merely grand ceremonies. So the emperor's portrait on coins, the accompanying titles, and a repeated circulation of those images through buying, paying, wages, gifts, and dues perform a quiet but deep task. They made authority constantly visible. When an image is held in one's hand every day, it becomes less distant than a monument, yet more durable than a shouted slogan in the square. Britannica also notes Augustus' expansion of coinage and use of coin design to project multiple aspects of imperial image. Here, the sacred and authority appear not only in incense smoke, they enter the habit of touch. From altar to coin, Rome learned to place its symbols both in solemn spaces and in ordinary life. But authority could not live by image alone. It also needed the repeated rhythm of the calendar. Thus, across many parts of the empire, feast days, commemorations, and ceremonies tied to the emperor thickened the community's shared memory. We have seen this already in Rome's ritual calendar. In the imperial period, it spread farther, into the rhythms of camps and towns. Britannica mentions a 3rd century calendar in the East listing rites for a garrison unit, including many old Roman ceremonies. That detail is especially striking. Even far from the capital, the soldier was drawn into a pattern of remembrance that made him feel part of the same wider order. When time is divided by ritual, cohesion depends not only on place, but on days remembered and repeated together. At this point, a harder question begins to appear. If emperor reverence can enter squares, coins, calendars, and camps, where is the boundary of obedience? Rome's answer was never wholly uniform, because imperial rules stretch across lands with different religious habits and communities with their own limits on what they could join. For that reason, the limits of obedience should not be imagined as hard line carved in stone. They were often a zone of negotiation, sometimes clear, sometimes blurred, depending on place and period. Some communities accepted the new symbols readily as signs of shared order. Others were more cautious when ritual touched the deepest parts of belief. Here Roman authority entered a delicate problem: how to keep the central symbol strong enough to gather people, without pressing so hard that buried local loyalties rose into resistance. It is at those boundaries that we understand more clearly why Rome was both durable and fragile. In some periods, refusing to take part in ceremonies connected to the emperor could draw special attention, especially when public life was tightly bound to commemorative rites and acts of reverence. Britannica's discussions of early Christianity note that, in many cases, refusal to participate in emperor cult became a mark that made people stand out and sometimes become targets. This does not mean every place and every moment was the same. Britannica also shows intervals of relative calm. But it reveals a larger truth. Once authority binds itself to common ritual, the line between religious difference and political nonconformity becomes highly sensitive. Suppose you stood in that square, would you think you were defending a private faith, or being seen as stepping out of the shared civic rhythm? And because those boundaries became increasingly visible, the story of emperor reverence in Rome cannot be told merely as a sequence of monuments and processions. It is the story of how an empire used the sacred to join distant lands, while constantly testing the degree of acceptance in each place, group, and period. On the brighter side, the symbols of Roma and Augustus, provincial councils, coinage, ritual, and calendrical rhythm created a sense of belonging to a larger order. On the harder side, that very spread exposed the limits of obedience, where local belief and memory would not easily dissolve into the central symbol. We now stand at the threshold of the next phase, no longer seeing emperor cult simply as a symbol of unity, but as an art of balance between center and periphery, authority and acceptance, public splendor, and hidden depths of human conviction. By now our journey has moved from household shrines, squares, priestly colleges, oaths, and military camps, revealing a durable rule. In Rome, authority stood firm only if it could speak in a sacred language. But as empire expanded across many shores, that language had to change tone. What once gathered a single city now had to reach distant lands where people carried local gods, distinct memories, and old patterns of devotion. In that turn, reverence for the emperor ceased to be only personal praise. It became a test of how far Rome could travel while still keeping a common ritual rhythm. Yet this is also where the hard question arises. When the central symbol moves far from the capital, where is the line between willing allegiance and compliance shaped by circumstance? From here, the story enters its most tense stretch, preserving unity without breaking local continuity. Begin not with a temple, but with a small coin changing hands in the market. Watch it pass from a wine cellar to a trader, a roadside guard, and a mother buying oil for the evening lamp. On that face, the emperor's portrait is not merely an image of a man. It is the daily presence of central authority in ordinary life. Unlike a monument that stands still and waits to be looked at, a coin travels by itself, through markets, ports, camps, shrines, and back into common hands. In that way, the emperor's image enters the rhythm of life without loud proclamation. More striking still is the layer of meaning that accompanies it. Titles, symbols, and sometimes divine imagery beside the portrait create a subtle picture of legitimacy. People did not see only a face. They saw an order introducing itself, day after day. From the hand that holds a coin, Roman power learned how to become familiar, repeated, and difficult to forget. Yet a coin touches the eye only for a moment. A temple is where a symbol asks to reside in local memory for much longer. In many provinces, shrines to Roma and Augustus emerged as meeting points between respect for the center and local religious tradition. What often happened there was not blunt replacement, but juxtaposition, insertion, and gradual adjustment. Communities kept the names of familiar local gods, while also making room for imperial symbols. So a temple in a distant province did not simply reflect the will of the capital. It also reflected how local society chose to receive, adapt, and interpret. In stone steps and the ordering of ritual, we can see a distinct Roman talent, not only imposing, but planting a central symbol among memories that had long taken root. But precisely where harmony seems strongest, fine cracks often begin to show. When a community builds a temple, offers incense, and joins rites before imperial symbols, the key question is not only do they participate, but how deeply do they believe and in what way? Suppose you were someone in a coastal province, raised with the gods of your homeland, now invited to a ceremony honoring Roma and Augustus in a newly built square. Would you enter with full reverence, or with the reserve of someone standing between two streams of memory? The pause inside that question marks the hardest limit of obedience to grasp. Rome could raise symbols, organize rites, and shape space, but the deepest layer of belief in the human heart was never easy to command. Lasting authority, therefore, needed more than grandeur. It needed the capacity to let others enter at their own pace. From this point, a truth about Rome appears, beautiful and precarious at once. Its unity was not one color, but a gradient. In the capital, ritual might appear formal and severe. In the provinces, the same symbol might enter life by other doors, through markets, local festivals, patronage ties, or the desire to be recognized within a wider order. This did not immediately weaken Roman authority. Often it made it more durable, because it could bend without surrendering the center. Yet every such bend also tested a limit. How much variation could still count as a common order? And at what point did the central symbol begin to fade? There was never one fixed answer. The question followed the empire like a debt paid in installments, and as time passed it became more visible in the religious life of the whole world Rome ruled. Then, history changed rhythm more quickly, and the empire's spiritual life shifted with it. The later centuries brought Rome into a world crowded with newer gods, multiple forms of devotion, promises of salvation, and religious communities sharing the same ever wider political space. In that landscape, religion's central place and authority did not disappear. It simply became harder to sustain in the old way. Imperial rule still needed ritual, symbols, and sacred language to present itself as the keeper of order. But once the sacred imagination of communities no longer converged around a few familiar forms, authority faced a more demanding task: how to remain a common point of reference in a world that had become more many-voiced. This is a crucial turning point in our story, not sudden collapse, but a long adjustment in which Rome learned to negotiate with the sacred legacy that had once carried it. To see that adjustment, do not look first at decrees, look at the stage of ritual. In transitional periods, what matters most is not only official pronouncements, but the ceremonial scene itself. Who stands at the center, who is invited, which symbols are raised, which recede, and how formal language shifts. Rome understood that people do not believe by argument alone. They believe with their eyes, ears, and habits repeated through festival seasons. Change the order of a procession, place one emblem higher than before, and public memory begins to turn. For that reason, later changes in religious life should not be seen only as changes in belief. They were also changes in the way authority appeared before the community. From square to temple, from prayer to vestment, every detail competed to answer one question: who still held the power to shape the face of common order in Rome's late afternoon? This is the moment to pause, not to summarize, but to ask directly into the heart of those who lived under the empire. Suppose you had lived through many emperors, watched symbols change, rituals shift rhythm, and promises of stability repeated year after year. What would make you continue to believe that this order was still worth attaching your life to? Perhaps the answer did not lie in fear alone, but in familiarity, in the benefits of peace, in honor bound to community, and in the feeling that life would become more chaotic without a center to orient it. Rome understood that very well. Thus, religion and Roman authority did not only elevate the ruler, it also made common life feel meaningful to those who would never enter the Senate house. When authority can touch meaning, it has a chance to outlast a single reign. Looking back across the whole journey, we no longer see scattered pieces, but a red thread running through them. We can now see why religion stood at the center of Roman power not as ornament, but as the heartbeat of shared life. From mos maiorum and pietas in family life, to pax deorum at public altars, from priestly colleges marking sacred time, to oaths in court and camp, from the household shrine to the emperor's face on coinage and temples in distant lands, every path leads to the same recognition. Order endures when placed within a sacred horizon that a community can see, repeat, and share. Rome's strength lay not only in building symbols, but in making them enter meals, marketplaces, festival days, and marching feet. And because those symbols reached so deeply, every change in ritual rhythm forced a change in how authority presented itself. Here, history becomes more than stone and statuary. It becomes the story of how people keep a shared world from coming apart. When only temple foundations, columns, and worn steps remain under the evening light, what continues to speak is not merely grandeur, but the question it once placed there. How does a vast community avoid dissolving under difference, ambition, and time? Rome answered in many ways, but one of its deepest answers was to place authority among ritual observance, ancestral memory, oaths, ceremony, and shared symbols. So when we walk the forum in imagination, or look at an old coin in a museum, we are not only looking at the past of an empire, we are looking at a profoundly human effort to make order something that can be felt, not merely proclaimed. And from this stopping point, the door to the next axis opens. After belief come questions no less deep: how Rome judged, bound, and kept a common promise among countless strangers. But the hardest challenge always comes after a pattern has worked for a very long time. What happens when people still perform the rite, yet no longer read it in the old way? In the later empire, we see a shift both slow and deep. Ritual spaces remain, symbols remain, ceremonies continue, yet the way people interpret them changes. What had once felt like an almost self-evident civic rhythm gradually becomes one choice among several spiritual paths. And it is in that moment that the true limits of authority become visible. Rome's old strength revealed its weakness here. Power can preserve outward forms for a long time, but it cannot preserve meaning unchanged if the inner rhythm of belief changes. The end of this journey, then, is no longer only about temples and ceremonies. It becomes a contest over who still has the right to define order in the eyes of the community. Look more closely at public ritual in the late empire, as if watching a stage with its lights turned gradually brighter. What matters is not only that rituals continue to be performed, but that they increasingly display authority before the crowd. Processions, vestments, ordered rank, and language of exaltation all help create a formal distance between the center of power and the rest of the world. None of this is entirely new. Rome had long used ritual to build legitimacy. But later on, the emphasis on the splendor of office grows denser, stronger, as though authority must be seen more often in order to preserve its former weight. Suppose you stood in the crowd, watching a ceremony grow ever more magnificent while daily life around you became more uncertain. Would you be captured by the grandeur, or begin to wonder what it was meant to cover? The moment the crowd begins to ask that question, the psychological depth of imperial rule becomes most visible. Still, it would be a mistake to treat this whole period as mere spectacle without substance. In the vast Roman world, ritual continued to perform something very real. It helped different communities keep sharing at least a few common rhythms of public life. Coins with the emperor's portrait, provincial ceremonies, temples, public blessings, commemorative days, all created a layer of shared memory, even if each region received it differently. That diversity of reception both sustained Rome and unsettled it. It helped Rome endure longer because the central symbol could still travel through many local channels. Yet that same process bent the meaning of the symbol differently wherever it went. From here, the question is no longer simply, was there worship or not? But what did worship mean in each setting? And that meaning shaped the real durability of cohesion. At this point, we reach the deepest question of the entire belief axis. Did authority need the sacred in order to elevate itself, or in order to let a community still recognize itself? For Rome, the answer was likely both. Mos maiorum, pietas, public altars, omens, priestly colleges, oaths, household shrines, military standards, the emperor's portrait. These images did not stand apart from one another. Together they formed a world in which order was felt through sight, sound, habit, and memory repeated across years. Suppose you were an old man living in the empire's later days, having seen many reigns, many rituals, and many shifts in belief. Perhaps what you clung to was not the name of the current ruler, but the sense that some common patterns still held life back from disintegration. Perhaps Rome's secret lay not in any single symbol, but in its ability to bind many layers of symbol into one shared sense of form. As we close this axis, Rome's ruins no longer appear as cold masses of stone, but as what remains of a rhythm of life once rehearsed through countless festival seasons. Each worn step, temple foundation, and faded inscription seems to hold the echo of a form of authority that understood something many later ages still struggle to relearn. Human beings do not live by command alone, but by meaning. Rome placed that meaning in ritual observance, ancestral memory, oaths, and shared symbols, turning cohesion across a vast world into something visible and repeatable. Yet for that same reason, when meaning changed, authority had to change with it. And this is the right way to leave the belief axis, not with a sealed conclusion, but with the sense that what happened in temples, squares, and camps had already prepared the ground for another Roman axis. After belief comes the story of places where people argued, recorded, judged, and bound common life to spoken words, a story that may feel closer to modern life than we expect.